It was only a matter of time. Progressives have decided to attack Anzac Day. This presumably has occurred before, but this year it's taken on a new level of force via the pro-Palestine groups. The case in point is a group called the Teachers and School Staff for Palestine. Quite how large this group is a little bit unclear, but it's been reported about in the media in outlets such as the Australian and Sky News. And it appears that their raison d'etre is to indoctrinate students, particularly with pro-Palestine talking points. They have, for example, produced a guide in relation to, quote, teaching for Palestine, which to my mind appears to be entirely irrelevant to fundamental concepts such as science and mathematics, but that seemingly is not going to stop them forcing their views down students' throats. They've now decided to attack Anzac Day, claiming it's a celebration of a massacre in Palestine in 1918, and therefore should be condemned and potentially boycotted. An Instagram post to this effect states the following. In the lead up to Anzac Day, Teachers and School Staff for Palestine Victoria, which is connected to hundreds of schools across Victoria, will be foregrounding the Anzac's massacre of up to 137 people at the village of Sarafan in Palestine, 1918. Teaching for Palestine, quote, challenging Anzac Day, also includes resources about the frontier wars, mistreatment of returned soldiers, Australian war crimes in Afghanistan, and the perspectives of Palestinian academics and advocates. A link to this vital resource is in our bio. Now, to be clear, people can support whatever cause they want, and certainly we should acknowledge misconduct when it has occurred. However, these teachers are not free to shove their views down the throats of a captive audience, especially a vulnerable audience such as children, who are not in a position to challenge any of these comments, and are not in a position to challenge any of the indoctrination, but who are in a position of dependence in relation to whoever is in a position of power. Children here are both impressionable and have no choice but to listen to the lopsided propaganda, and therefore teachers really ought not to be shoving their views down the throats of students, contrary to the interest potentially of those students themselves, but also their parents, especially when those views can't be challenged and can't be corrected, and are simply just a matter of opinion in relation to how they are presented. Because while there might have been a massacre, how you talk about it matters, and the tone and the context you give matters. And if they're presenting the Anzacs in a very negative manner, without talking about all of the other positive contexts associated with them, then it is going to create a very lopsided and inaccurate position. And therefore they ought not to be imposing these views onto students. Nevertheless, that seemingly is what they're doing, both in relation to Anzac Day, but also their pro-Palestine talking points. The fundamental problem, therefore, is where and how they're presenting their views. Not that they have the views per se, but what they're doing with them and how they are forcing them onto people who simply don't have a choice. Now, you, for example, might not like my views. You might think that I'm inaccurate. You might think that I'm wrong. But you're free to turn off this channel. You have that free will. Maybe some of you will do that right now. But the students in these classes aren't free to just get up and leave. They aren't free to call out what the teachers are saying. And that is a fundamental issue. The other fundamental problem with this specific incident in relation to Anzac Day is they have a fundamental misunderstanding of Anzac Day entirely. It does appear, for example, that there was a massacre. It does appear that the Anzacs had committed some war crimes as we had now perceived them. It does appear that members of the ADF might have committed war crimes in other theatres. That appears to have been the case. The Australian, for example, reports in relation to that massacre. The attack does not appear to be mentioned on the Australian War Memorial website, but it is described in the New Zealand Ministry for Cultural and Heritage History. It states that relations between the Anzac Mounted Division and Palestinian Arabs reached a new low on early December 1918, when Trooper Leslie Lowry was shot dead after disturbing a thief in his tent. That night, a large group of New Zealanders and Australians exacted vigilante justice, burning the nearby Arab village of Sarafand al-Ammar. to the ground and killing around 40 of its male inhabitants. The Anzacs refused to cooperate with the subsequent British investigation, leaving General Edmund Allenby to condemn them as a lot of cowards and murderers. The village was later rebuilt by the British Army, with Australian and New Zealand contributing to the cost. So here it does appear that there was misconduct. It's not entirely clear how many people were involved in this, because it certainly wasn't all of the Anzacs. Many Anzacs, for example, were on the Western Front, completely away from that theatre of war. Therefore, condemning all Anzacs appears to be just completely wrong. Many Anzacs weren't even in that location, let alone in any way involved in this at all. I dare say many of the Anzacs weren't even aware this was occurring. Now granted, this reporting makes sense to occur. It is valid for us to talk about misconduct that occurred so that we can correct that going forward. But that's a far cry from condemning Anzac Day in totality, and from trying to boycott Anzac Day or talk about it being banned or pushed to the side. It's a far cry from protesting on Anzac Day or about Anzac Day. We can acknowledge wrongdoing without going that next step, going to that next extreme level. It's a whole world apart. Now, the fact that there was misconduct is also a little bit tangential, even if that misconduct was bad. Anzac Day, for example, is about the whole of the Anzacs. It's about the sacrifices the troops made throughout many wars, although especially in World War I. There has been misconduct in World War I and other theatres. That doesn't mean that we should ignore the misconduct or ignore the sacrifices of the many innocent Australians who conducted themselves appropriately and were thrown into a war that they didn't necessarily want to be involved in at all. And this raises a couple of fundamental issues. First, simply because some people committed misconduct, it doesn't mean that all people are guilty of that misconduct. Anzacs fought in many theatres of war in World War I, and many of them didn't do anything of the sort or commit any of that misconduct. For example, the Western Front, like I mentioned before. Anzac Day is also about the commemoration of all troops in all wars. Focusing on an isolated incident in 1918 completely misses the whole point. These teachers for Palestine seem to not understand what Anzac Day is even about. So, for example, to turn this back on them, Hamas committed misconduct on October 7th when it massacred, kidnapped, tortured, or committed other misconduct in relation to 1,400 civilians. Therefore, it would appear we should ban their pro-Palestine rallies. Indeed, this might actually seem somewhat appropriate and apt, since many of these rallies appear to have morphed into pro-Hamas and anti-Israel rallies and appear to involve a degree of intimidation. It appears they're actually approving of, or at least accepting, the massacre that occurred on October 7th. Anzac Day isn't celebrating any misconduct that occurred. It acknowledges misconduct, but it's commemorating the sacrifices of troops throughout many of these wars, many of whom are innocent. By contrast, the pro-Palestine rallies appear to have just morphed into celebrating October 7th. Now, this isn't to say that teachers and school staff of Palestine are necessarily celebrating October 7th, but they are associated with a tenor of rallies that appears to be doing so. And therefore, those rallies should also seemingly be banned, one would think, by parity of logic. But in any case, this certainly isn't the type of day to be trying to boycott or to try to disrupt. After all, without the Anzacs, we probably wouldn't really have modern Australia. And we certainly wouldn't have an Australia in which they would be able to do any of these protests, which is rather ironic, I think.